Hi, everyone. I hope you're all doing well, you're safe, you're healthy, and you're not too bored. I was delighted to find out one day last week that I could continue to read to you via the Read Aloud West Virginia YouTube page. So I contacted Ms. Schuyleman, and she was very happy to go along with it and said that she would send the link to your parents. So here we are. We're going to try this out and see how it goes. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to read some more stories from Sideways Stories from the Wayside School. And as you can see, this is upside down and backwards. That's because it's facing me, so it's a mirror image. Just wanted to let you know that I'm going to read 3 stories from this book today, and as long as it goes well, I will continue to read stories from this book and then move on to another book. I'm going to try to hold it to about 20 minutes or so. After that, it gets a little bit too long. So let's start with story 5. And story 5, as you can see, is about Todd. Todd's upside down and backwards as well. So here we have Todd, and Todd is handing a workbook to a person in a mask. All of the children in Mrs. Jewell's class, except Todd, were talking and carrying on. Todd was thinking. Todd always thought before he spoke. When he got an idea, his eyes lit up. Todd finished thinking and began to speak. But before he said 2 words, Mrs. Jewell called him. "Todd," she said, "you know better than to talk in class. You must learn to work quietly like the other children." She wrote his name on the blackboard under the word discipline. And discipline is all in capital letters. Todd looked around in amazement. All of the other children who had been talking and screaming and fighting only seconds earlier were quietly working in their workbooks. Todd scratched his head. A child was given 3 chances in Mrs. Jewell's class. The first time he did something wrong, Mrs. Jewell wrote his name on the blackboard under the word discipline. The second time he did something wrong, she put a check next to his name. And the third time he did something wrong, she circled his name. Todd reached into his desk and pulled out his workbook. He had only just started on it when he felt someone tap him on the shoulder. It was Joy. "What page are you on?" Joy asked. "Page 4, Todd whispered. "I'm on page 11, Joy said. Todd didn't say anything. He didn't want to get into trouble. He just went back to work. 5 minutes later, Joy tapped him again. Todd ignored her, so Joy poked him in the back with her pencil. Todd pretended he didn't notice. Joy got up from her seat and sharpened her pencil. She came back and poked it in Todd's back. "What page are you on?" she asked. "Page 5, Todd answered. "Boy, are you dumb," said Joy. "I'm on page 29. "It isn't a race," Todd whispered. 5 minutes later, Joy pulled Todd's hair and didn't let go until he turned around. "What page are you on?" she demanded. "Page 6, Todd answered, as quietly as he could. "I'm on page 200, Joy shouted. Todd was very angry. "Will you please let me do my work and stop bothering me?" Mrs. Jewell heard him. "Todd, what did I say about talking in class?" Todd scratched his head. Mrs. Jewell put a check next to Todd's name on the blackboard under the word discipline. Todd really tried to be good. He knew that if he talked one more time, Mrs. Jewell would circle his name. Then he'd have to go home early at 12 o'clock on the kindergarten bus, just as he had the day before and the day before that. In fact, there hadn't been a day since Mrs. Jules took over the class that she didn't send Todd home early. She said she did it for his own good. The other children went home at 2 o'clock. Todd wasn't really bad. He just always got caught. He really wanted to stay past 12 o'clock. He wanted to find out what the class did from 12 to 2. But it didn't look as though this was going to be his day. It was only 10:30, and he already had 2 strikes against him. He sealed his lips and went back to work. There was a knock on the door. Mrs. Jules opened it. 2 men stepped in wearing masks. "Give us all your money," they demanded. "All I have is a nickel," said Mrs. Jules. "I have a dime," said Marisha. "I have 13 cents, said Leslie. "I have 4 cents, said Damien. "What kind of bank is this?" asked one of the robbers. "It's not a bank, it's a school," said Todd. "Can't you read?" "No," said the robbers. "Neither can I," said Todd. "Do you mean we walked all the way up 30 flights of stairs for nothing?" asked the robber. "Don't you have anything valuable?" Todd's eyes lit up. "We sure do," he said. "We have knowledge." He grabbed Joy's workbook and gave it to the robbers. "Knowledge is much more valuable than money." "Thanks, kid," said one of the robbers. "Maybe I'll give up being a criminal and become a scientist," said the other. They left the room without hurting anyone. "Now I don't have a workbook," complained Joy. Mrs. Jules gave her a new one. Joy had to start all the way back at the beginning. "Hey, Joy, what page are you on?" asked Todd. "Page 1, Joy sighed. "I'm on page 8, laughed Todd triumphantly. Mrs. Jules heard him. She circled his name. Todd had 3 strikes against him. At 12 o'clock, he left the room to go home early on the kindergarten bus. But this time when he left, he was like a star baseball player leaving the field. All the children stood up, clapped their hands, and whistled. Todd scratched his head. Okay, our next story, story 6, is about Bibi. And here we have Bibi, who is an artist. And if you look closely, you'll notice she's got a little beret on her head. And she's drawing all sorts of things, including a fish and a watermelon. And I can't tell what some of the others are. It looks like a house, but I'm not sure. Okay, and she's got Calvin right behind her. Bibi was a girl with short brown hair, a little beamy nose, and totally tiny toes, and big brown eyes. Her full name was Bibi Gunn. She was the fastest drawer in Mrs. Jules' class. She could draw a cat in less than 45 seconds, a dog in less than 30, and a flower in less than 8 seconds. But of course, Bibi never drew just one dog, or one cat, or one flower. Art was from 12:30 to 1:30. Why, in that time, she could draw 50 cats, 100 flowers, 20 dogs, and several eggs or watermelons. It took her the same amount of time to draw a watermelon as an egg. Calvin sat next to Bibi. He didn't think he was very good at art. Why, it took him the whole period just to draw one airplane. So instead, he just helped Bibi. He was Bibi's assistant. As soon as Bibi would finish one masterpiece, Calvin would take it from her and set down a clean sheet of paper. Whenever her crayon ran low, Calvin was ready with a new crayon. That way Bibi didn't have to waste any time. And in return, Bibi would draw 5 or 6 airplanes for Calvin. It was 12:30, time for art. Bibi was ready. On her desk was a sheet of yellow construction paper. In her hand was a green crayon. Calvin was ready. He held a stack of paper and a box of crayons. "Ready, Bibi?" said Calvin. Ready, Calvin, said Bebe. Okay, said Mrs. Jules. Time for art. She had hardly finished her sentence when Bebe had already drawn a picture of a leaf. Calvin took it from her and put another piece of paper down. Red, called Bebe. Calvin handed Bebe a red crayon. Blue, called Bebe. He gave her a blue crayon. They were quite a pair. Their teamwork was remarkable. Bebe drew pictures as fast as Calvin could pick up the old paper and set down the new. A fish, an apple, 3 cherries, bing, bing, bing. At 1:30, Mrs. Jules announced, Okay, class, art is over. Bebe dropped her crayon and fell over her desk. Calvin sighed and leaned back in his chair. He could hardly move. They had broken their old record. Bebe had drawn 378 pictures. They lay in a pile on Calvin's desk. Mrs. Jules walked by. Calvin, did you draw all these pictures? Calvin laughed. No, I can't draw. Bebe drew them all. Well then, what did you draw? Asked Mrs. Jules. I didn't draw anything, said Calvin. Why not? Don't you like art? Asked Mrs. Jules. I love art, said Calvin. That's why I didn't draw anything. Mrs. Jules did not understand. It would have taken me the whole period just to draw one picture, said Calvin, and Bebe would only have been able to draw 100 pictures. But with the two of us working together, she was able to draw 378 pictures. That's a lot more art. Bebe and Calvin shook hands. No, said Mrs. Jules. That's not how you measure art. It isn't how many pictures you have, but how good the pictures are. Why, a person could spend his whole life just drawing one picture of a cat. In that time, I'm sure Bebe could draw 1,000,000 cats. 2,000,000, said Bebe. Mrs. Jules continued. But if that one picture is better than each of Bebe's 2,000,000, then that person has produced more art than Bebe. Bebe looked as if she was going to cry. She picked up all the pictures from Calvin's desk and threw them in the garbage, and then she ran from the room. I thought her pictures were good, said Calvin. He reached into the garbage pail and took out a crumpled up picture of an airplane. Bebe walked outside into the playground. Louis, the yard teacher, spotted her. Where are you going? He asked. I'm going home to draw a picture of a cat, said Bebe. Will you bring it to school and show it to me tomorrow? Louis asked. Tomorrow? Laughed Bebe. By tomorrow, I doubt if I'll even be finished with one whisker. All right. And our last story for today is a story about Calvin. Again, upside down and backwards. And Calvin is walking down the stairs, and you can kind of see that in between is floor 18 and floor 20. Calvin's in between the two floors as he is walking down the stairs. So, final story, sort of, Calvin. Calvin had a big, round face. Calvin, said Mrs. Jules, I want you to take this note to Mrs. Zarvies for me. Miss Zarvies? Asked Calvin. Yes, Miss Zarvies, said Mrs. Jules. You know where she is, don't you? Yes, said Calvin. She's on the 19th story. That's right, Calvin, said Mrs. Jules. Take it to her. Calvin didn't move. Well, what are you waiting for? Asked Mrs. Jules. She's on the 19th story, said Calvin. Yes, we have already established that fact, said Mrs. Jules. The 19th story, Calvin repeated. Yes, Calvin, the 19th story, said Mrs. Jules. Now take it to her before I lose my patience. But Mrs. Jules, said Calvin. Now, Calvin, said Mrs. Jules, unless you would rather go home on the kindergarten bus. Yes, ma'am, said Calvin. Slowly he walked out the door. Ha! Laughed Terence. Take it to the 19th story. Give it to Miss Zarvies, hooted Myron. Have fun on the 19th story, called Jason. Calvin stood outside the door of the classroom. He didn't know where to go. As you know, when the builder built Wayside School, he accidentally built it sideways. But he also forgot to build the 19th story. He built the 18th and the 20th, but no 19th. He said he was very sorry. There was also no Miss Zarvies. Miss Zarvies taught the class on the 19th story. Since there was no 19th story, there was no Miss Zarvies. And besides that, as if Calvin didn't have enough problems, there was no note. Mrs. Jules had never given Calvin a note. Boy, this is just great, thought Calvin. Just great. I'm supposed to take a note that I don't have to a teacher who doesn't exist and who teaches on a story that was never built. He didn't know what to do. He walked down to the 18th story, then back up to the 20th, then back down to the 18th, and back up again to the 20th. There was no 19th story. There never was a 19th story. And there never will be a 19th story. Calvin walked down to the administration office. He decided to put the note in Miss Zarvies' mailbox. But there wasn't one of those either. That didn't bother Calvin too much, however, since he didn't have a note. He looked out the window and saw Louis, the yard teacher, shooting baskets. Louis will know what to do, he thought. Calvin went outside. Hey, Louis, Calvin called. Hi, Calvin, said Louis. He tossed him the basketball. Calvin dribbled up and took a shot. He missed. Louis tipped it in. Do you want to play a game? Louis asked. I don't have time, said Calvin. I have to deliver a note to Miss Zarvies up on the 19th story. Then what are you doing all the way down here? Louis asked. There is no 19th story, said Calvin. Then where is Miss Zarvies? Asked Louis. There is no Miss Zarvies, said Calvin. What are you going to do with the note? Asked Louis. There is no note, said Calvin. I understand, said Louis. That's good, said Calvin, because I sure don't. It's very simple, said Louis. You are not supposed to take no notes to no teachers. You already haven't done it. Calvin still didn't understand. I'll just have to tell Mrs. Jules that I couldn't deliver the note, he said. That's good, said Louis. The truth is always best. Besides, I don't think I understand what I said either. Calvin walked back up the 30 flights of stairs to Mrs. Jules' class. Thank you very much, Calvin, said Mrs. Jules. Calvin said, Mrs. Jules interrupted him. That was a very important note, and I'm glad I was able to count on you. Yes, but you see, said Calvin. You delivered the note to Miss Zarvies on the 19th story? Asked Jason. How did you do it? What do you mean, how did he do it? Asked Mrs. Jules. He gave Miss Zarvies the note. Some people, Jason, are responsible. But you see, Mrs. Jules, said Calvin, the note was very important, said Mrs. Jules. I told Miss Zarvies not to meet me for lunch. Don't worry, said Calvin. She won't. Good, said Mrs. Jules. I have a coffee can full of Tootsie Roll Pops on my desk. You may help yourself to one for being such a good messenger. Thanks, said Calvin, but really, it was nothing. And I was interested because I'd never read this book before. So I thought, well, it says there's no 19th story. So I looked. And here is the 19th story. And the 19th story, which is upside down and backwards, is about Miss Zarpes. And it says, there is no Miss Zarpes. There is no 19th story. Sorry. Okay, that's it for today. I will do this again. I hope it works out. I hope you have a good week and enjoy yourself and stay healthy and wash your hands. It's great seeing you all again. Bye-bye.